Today's passage comes from Hebrews chapter 10, verses 5 through 10. Hear the word of the Lord. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure." Then I said, "See, God, I have come to do your will, O God. In the scroll of the book it is written of me." When he said above, "You have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings," these are offered according to the law. Then he added, "See, I have come to do your will." He abolishes the first in order to establish the second. And it is by God's will that we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Like our tales of Santa Claus, traditional Christianity has often used fear and guilt as tools to keep people in line. You better watch out. You better not cry. Better not pout. I'm telling you why Santa Claus is coming to town. So often that is, or seems to be, the way we talk about God. I cannot begin to count the times I heard comments about God watching my actions, comments used to intimidate me into following prescribed norms. That is kind of the attitude that enforces our notions of sacrifice being necessary to appease a God of wrath. Is it really where our understanding of God's essential character must reside? Perhaps we should wonder along with the Grinch if Christmas doesn't mean a little bit more. We read the Hebrew Scriptures with a sense that sacrifice is essential to worshiping God. The problem is we don't understand what sacrifice meant to the Hebrew people. Rather than approach it from their perspective, we read the words from a standpoint of pagan concepts designed either to appease the wrath of a spiritual being or otherwise manipulate and control what lies beyond our reach. Sure, there are instances in the Hebrew Scriptures where those notions bleed into Hebrew practice, but it is not the central understanding of Yahweh, nor how we are to approach Yahweh. It should be obvious to us that any attempt to manipulate God is hardly worship. Using rites, rituals, other formulas of magic is manipulation. It's not placing ourselves into another's service. It is a crass attempt to gain the upper hand, to be the ones in control, to defy our lesser status. If we understand sacrifice as appeasement, we're still attempting to control another, even if by some more palatable means. It's like I heard said of one of our wealthiest billionaires this week. They would be glad to make investments to eradicate global hunger as long as it would result in their avoiding taxes. The translation seems to be something like, "I would be glad to do what is right as long as I can avoid other responsibilities." That's not sacrifice. Unfortunately, it's the way we all too often attempt to define it. It's making a show of being, believing, and doing what and who we are not. It's pretense. It's putting on a false front to cover up the truth of who we are. A mask to help us play make-believe. It's manipulation. For the center of Hebrew thought, sacrifice was about drawing near to God. It was coming into Yahweh's presence. It was offering thanks for Yahweh's provision, direction, goodwill. It was a statement of one's desire to be in fellowship with God, the God of Israel, of taking up the responsibility of belonging to that nation called by Yahweh's name. It was submission and approach. Prophets like Isaiah recognized that so many sacrifices simply did not carry that meaning. Going through the motions and rituals of public worship does not equate with living according to Yahweh's plan for human life and interaction. I can give all sorts of gifts to the needy, poor, and desperate. But as Paul states, it has no meaning if these actions do not arise from love. Public generosity out of one's abundance is no more sacrifice than any other mode of pretense. It's a guilt response. It's a ploy to put on a show, make an appearance, to pretend to be who we are not. Guilt does not draw us close to God. Guilt does not draw us close to anyone, for that matter. Fear and guilt are not tools for bringing about reconciliation, love, community, and trust. We may find them useful for manipulating others, but they are hardly useful for the purposes of reconciliation, building community, fashioning trust. They can be harnessed by those desiring to wield power, but they do not edify after the manner of love and grace. The author of Hebrews understood this. Understood that despite all the elaborate ritual behind sacrifice in the Hebrew Scriptures, the effectiveness of sacrifice depended not on the rite, but on the disposition of one receiving it. In today's passage, he quotes from Psalm 40, finding support for the concept that sacrifice in itself does not fulfill God's will and is insufficient to guarantee God's goodwill. It is lacking in this regard because it has no power or claim over God. Sacrifice is not magic. It has no power to manipulate God. It can never become a means to control God. We cannot hope to wield it to appease God, specifically because sacrifice is empty before one who is not impressed with it. There is no power, law, or rule giving sacrifice such power. There is no magic operating with God as its object. If we want to impress God, we would need to present something God really wants, something God lacks, something very valuable to God and beyond God's reach. I'm hardly in any position to accomplish that. Today's passage reminds us that God was never impressed by sacrifices, burnt offerings, sin offerings. God never took pleasure in those things we have so often wielded to manipulate our standing before God. In response, the passage adds, I have come to do your will, as a much more fulfilling response than any sacrifice we might bring. Our difficulty is living up to those words. Isaiah wrote about our attempts at righteousness as being filthy rags. They have no merit through which we might impress God. If God is not impressed, how would we be able to manipulate, coerce, or even enter into any kind of bargain? Would God be impressed with herds of animals sacrificed on an altar? Would God be impressed with the balance of my bank accounts going to meet needs around me? Would God be blown away with my feeding a neighbor a meal, adopting a stray animal, getting a homeless person off the streets? Aren't those simply things that we should be doing? You know, in the course of loving our neighbors in the way according to the way we love ourselves. The good news in today's passage, however, is that sacrifice is not required. It never really was. What works in our favor is God's will. It is God who wants us reconciled. It is God who desires that we be sanctified. It is God who invites us into the very throne room of heaven, unmediated by sacrifice, offering, or whatever other means we might conceive of to coerce God's love. Instead of all that, instead of paltry attempts to control or force God's hand, we are invited. God's love, God's initiative, God's grace bring us into the presence of the Almighty. It is all of God. It began with God. It was enacted by God. It was accomplished through God and by God's self. Given that, what else could we seek? What more could we offer? What could we possibly believe might force God to do what God has already so willingly and freely done on our behalf? This is the beauty of what we celebrate as Christmas approaches. What we could never do for ourselves, God has already done. It's there awaiting our acceptance, our embrace. There's nothing left to do. Christ has accomplished all that is needed. It is up to us simply to live the reality of God's presence among us, freely inviting us to join, inviting others to join with us in this life of God's full acceptance. Guilt, fear, intimidation, coercion, none of these factor in. There's no room for them. Grace shoves them all aside, taking them off the table. No sacrifice could do that. Then, again, no sacrifice was ever needed. It never was it?